Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and it is March 24th, 2009, and welcome to the future of open source, the future of education, which should maybe be the future of open source. This is part of our interview series sponsored by KnowledgeWorks and Illuminate. We express our appreciation and thanks to them. Sheila, I'm going to mute you for just a second because we could hear your background noise. We're glad to have you here. Before we introduce the guest panelist, I am going to give you a quick introduction if you're new to Illuminate. You'll see in this slide a set of features that you can use. We probably won't do any polling tonight, so you don't need to worry about that. But if you look down at the bottom of the participant window, you can see some emoticons that allow you to express your response to things. And the little smiley face says that you're happy with something. Clapping is another way of expressing appreciation. Confused emoticon is you're confused. And thumbs agree with something. You can send a message in the chat area. I want to encourage you to go up to View, Layout, and select the wide layout. And that will give you a little bit better view of the chat window. You can scroll by pretty quickly depending on how many people are in the... We don't have many tonight, so that shouldn't be a problem, but it's still it's a better view from my standpoint. If you do send a message, you can send a message to the whole room, or if you click on that little down arrow, you can send it to an individual participant, but be alerted that anybody who's a moderator can actually see all of the messages, whether they are they're private. Okay, at this time I want you to look for a little wand that has a red star at the end, like the one here. You'll find that to the left of your whiteboard, the area that's showing the slides. And if you would, go ahead and click on this. Click on that little wand, and then click on this map, and let us know where you are right now. We know that the path of a storm. So one in Australia, which is Kathryn. Hooray. The rest of the United States. Feel free to put the city that you're in the chat, along with maybe the temperature and what time it is there. Kathryn will be most interested. Okay, so it's a delight to have a special panel together tonight. Sure appreciative of their being able to make themselves available. Looking forward to a really good discussion that I care quite a bit about, which is the use of open source software in education. I'm going to ask at this time if our guests would each introduce themselves, give a 30-second introduction. You'll have a chance during the rest of the evening to say a little bit more, but just a brief background of who you are and your association with open source, and we'll start with you, Jeff.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Elkner. I'm a teacher in Arlington, Virginia at Arlington Public Schools, and I've been a computer science teacher. I've been using free software in the classroom since the mid-90s.
And Jeff, for our audience, would you just tell us why you called it free software?
Well, the free and free software refers to freedom, and I'm sure I'll be bringing that up again later tonight as the discussion goes on. But to me, that's the real important thing about free software in the context of education, is that it gives us the freedom to share, to collaborate, to learn with each other without the restrictions that proprietary software has.
Great, thank you. So Sheila, you're next.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sheila Gatling. I am a retired veteran of the middle school classroom. I used open source for several years before I retired. Currently, I'm a co-founder of Moodle Rooms, an e-learning company, and I just found open source to be the answer to the everyday tech questions in the classroom. It was just a wonderful opportunity for my students to use technology without having the expensive outlay that they normally would. if it was up, if they had to buy it themselves. So it absolutely changed my life in the classroom, and theirs too.
Great, and I'm hoping you'll talk more about that, Sheila. Next
Sure.
up is Mike Huffman.
Hello, I'm Mike Huffman from Indiana. I have recently retired, spent about 35 years in the Department of Education, and the past 6 or 7 of those involved in implementing Linux throughout the state of Indiana in Indiana's high schools. We developed that project and pursued it for one very important reason, and that is improving learning. Schools simply can't afford proprietary software and expensive hardware. They have to look at a new way of doing this, and open source is a major piece of that. And I totally agree with Jeff and everyone about the freedom, the free software moniker, but for schools it's a very practical matter. We'll have an opportunity to discuss that.
Terrific. Thanks, Mike. Kathryn, you with us?
I am indeed. Hi, everyone. It's great to be able to talk with you all from this side of the world. And I came to open source through doing my PhD. I was looking at how to calculate the costs that the federal government and state governments were paying to proprietary software as part of my research. And I accidentally came across the budget estimates for one state in Australia called Victoria, and I accidentally came across the forward estimates in formal budget papers for Microsoft licenses, and I was staggered by the amount of money that state was allocating to those licenses at that time. And I was talking to my son, who at that stage was 16, and he kept saying to me, have you looked at open source? And he wouldn't let up. He kept telling me that I needed to look at open source. And eventually he got me to look at open source, and I have been a convert ever since. And so my PhD some time ago now it looks at what open source means and what it means for schools. And I've, since that time, written book chapters about the issues for open source in schools and done cost analyses of those. And I've talked and written about it from the point of view of freedom, from the point of view of cost, from the point of view of students. If they're really going to have the ability to be citizens in the 21st century, they need to not only be users and consumers of technology, but producers of those technologies. And it seems to me that open source is the way that we can do that. So that's a bit of background about how I came to open source. I worked for 25 years for the South Australian Department of Education. I'm now an associate professor at the University of Canberra, and I also have national responsibility for technology policies, the committee that makes those technology policies across schools, vocational education, training and higher education. I'm sorry, Steve, that was a bit longer than 30 seconds, but that's my introduction.
Well, we give you allowance because you're speaking from such a distance. Laura, you're next.
Well, there's not a lot left, but I'll say I've worked in education at both the K-12 and higher ed for about 20 years now. And one of the pieces with open source from a teacher perspective, it gets a little bit to that flexibility piece, but one of the things that I really started hearing teachers saying is, if they had to wait for a district to adopt a specific piece of software, by the time they needed it, it was out of date. And what open source is allowing teachers to do is to go out and find, through the help of, when I was at the department, things we were doing, but through others, to find software that they can use in their classroom, send home and have with kids, and not worry about that 1 year lag that it might take for adoption and the funding that would go with that adoption. So open source has allowed teachers a lot more flexibility to be innovative in their classroom. But it gets back to what everyone is saying, and one of the mantras we've used in Indiana is affordable, sustainable, repeatable, and scalable. And open source for education is the only piece that's going to work if we want to put our money in teachers.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, so I'm gonna hit hard right off the bat, and I've put up a poll at the top of the screen that we can all participate in, and you'll see it's A, B, C, D, and E. Those letters across the top where the icons are, and let's assume that E actually represents F for fail. And if you were to give a grade to our educational system with regard to the use of open source right now, what would that grade be? And while you're picking that grade, you click on it, and it will show up next to your name. So Kathryn says F. I'd like to ask a very direct question. These interviews that I've been holding on the future of education have typically had between 50 and 100 people attend. You know, we've got, by my count, 1, 2, Denise maybe is only one person there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We have 8 people listening tonight. Is that reflective of a lack of understanding about open source? Why would we have so few people who would be interested in hearing about open source in education? And Jeff, we're going to start this round with you again.
Well, I can only speak for my local jurisdiction, and I see I'm rating a little higher than my colleagues here, but Arlington Public Schools has been very supportive over the years of sort of letting me be an incubator. I've been doing this for 10 years within the system, and it's spreading. It's getting more and more. There was even a discussion recently countywide about switching to open office and not paying for the next office license that's coming out. Our school system has supported the development of a content management system that we're using statewide now, or piloting statewide in the state of Virginia. So I'd have to say that within Arlington Public Schools, they've done a fairly good job. I mean, they're open to the idea of going this way, and they're exploring it more and more.
Sheila, any response from you?
I think we're the reason why we have a smaller audience tonight is because the president is speaking. That is the only reason people are not here. Okay. As far as using the technology in schools, people are. I know I gave my rating as D. But in my school district on Long Island, if the instructional leader of the school is not informed or uses technology, then the whole program suffers. Oftentimes it's farmed out to people who come in and make presentations, or even the tech coordinator who is so overworked. You have literally too many cooks spoiling the broth, and not enough people, in my view, in my area, who are informed about the advantages of open source and would rather rely on something that costs X amount of dollars rather than opt for open source, which is affordable and, as someone said, sustainable and reusable, and just the solution for schools today.
So, Sheila, that's fascinating to me. Mike, do you think it's as simple as decision-making about computers has been largely relegated to business units? Those business units get marketed to by commercial companies, and they are then purchasing things that are divorced from the actual classroom need?
It could be part of that. You've heard some of this before, but I still firmly believe that the reason schools aren't jumping on this on their own, and some are, I don't mean to say that none are, but the reason the majority aren't is because we still do not have a good implementation guide for schools. You know, steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. We still have issues regarding authentication, and authentication especially to Windows server. Those are some of the things that keep people out. I think if those things were easy, especially in today's economy, this would be a no-brainer. And I think the sooner we get on those topics, the sooner we deal with them, the sooner we get Linux certification down to where it's manageable, people have ready access to it. I think schools will do this automatically.
Kathryn, you were quick to put the E/F up there. What's your thought? Remember, you need to click your mic button for us to hear you. If you're talking, we're not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Can you hear me now? Sorry about that. Yeah, I think Australia is in a funny situation in that while we have fantastic software developments that are in open source like Moodle, and like, I don't know how many people have seen LAMS, and then we have the Samba project. So we have a number of projects in Australia that are open source and terrific. But I think the reason in Australia, and the reason I gave an E/F, is because when I think about, well, what would we want to see in terms of schools, I think about the penetration or the scalability that's occurred, and we see open source mostly in the private sector, in private schools, rather than the government sector. And so, and I think the reason that we don't see it in the government sector is because they're schmoozed by Microsoft in particular, but also other proprietary software companies. And there's a myth about the quality of off-the-shelf products where our CIOs or CTOs tend to believe that if you get it off the shelf, then it's going to work without any technical support, which obviously is not correct, but that's why I call it a myth. So I think there's some issues there about who has control of what software gets into schools.
Laura?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with everyone so far. I think for the most part, from the teacher perspective, most teachers truly don't care. It's what you get used to. And, you know, I mean, there's been a lot of various studies out there between Blackboard and Moodle and through other open source and proprietary, and whichever one they start on first is the one they tend to like better because it's a comfort level. And I think most people have been using proprietary software, so as they start to shift over to open source, as soon as something looks a little different, their comfort level, the learning curve is back, and they're, you know, I think we've all heard enough tech directors liken shifting to open source as moving from, you know, Windows 3.1 to Windows 95, or from Mac to Windows back in the day, and no one has really caught on to the fact that most kids really don't care. Most teachers truly don't care if they actually get the software in their classroom. But there's such a perception that it's going to be difficult. And, you know, many of the packages don't look as slick as the proprietary software. And so it is, I think there is a perception that it's a lesser than piece of software that's going to education where business would have a proprietary piece. I think it's starting to shift. I know in Indiana, most of our schools are using open source. Many of them, if not most of them, I mean, as far as an LMS, most of them are using Moodle. Because when they look at, you know, and they look at the cost and they look at the benefits, but it's showing them that flexibility piece that Jeff brought up. You know, showing them that hot potato can be put in with Moodle, you know, and all of the pieces that they know are still there. And because there isn't a company behind open source demoing it to them, it requires the school to do that. And that's where that tech director piece comes in. And if the tech director is not behind this, he is not going to demo all the features of open source when he can just, you know, install a box and give them a box.
Okay, so this is really interesting to me, and I'm tempted to move into the solution piece to kind of drill down on what we can do to help change this. But before we do, I'd like to explore a little bit more what the potential benefits are. And if we were to relax a little and think about open source within the context of the future of education, what kind of benefits could we reasonably describe as accruing from the use of open source software more broadly in schools? Can we be a little expansive here? And why don't we do this one by asking you as moderators to raise your hand if you'd like to address this question. If we're dreaming 10 years into the future and open source is a more pervasive part of education, what benefits would we see? So Kathryn, you're first there.
Thanks, Steve. For me, it's really important for being able to develop students so that they can take their place as a citizen in society once they leave school. I don't believe it's appropriate that schools teach students skills of a particular piece of software. They need to understand how to access support, how to access software that's not going to break the bank, and that they need to feel that they're in control of their own lives in doing that. And the dependency model of proprietary software, I just do not see serving students in that way. For me, proprietary software is a bit like becoming an alcoholic. You become dependent upon a particular product, and I don't think that that's appropriate for developing students as lifelong learners. And alongside of that is the issue of costs that we've already canvassed today.
Mike, your thoughts?
Sorry, I hit the wrong button. I agree with everything Kathryn said. I mean, we really have to begin teaching skills instead of software packages. We have to open all of that up. I think the benefits 10 years down the road of open source, there are a couple, actually. I think open source is having a huge impact right now on the private sector. I think it's pushing Microsoft in the development of new software and new ways of packaging it. A recent article in one of the magazines indicated that Windows Mobile may soon be released as open source. I think it's having an impact in that regard. In the schools, the cost is the major issue for acquiring it. In other words, they can get it free, but the main advantage is going to be access for the students. In Indiana, we found that the single most important thing that we did was to put the technology in the hands of the kids. It invigorated the teachers. It improved their teaching. It made them better, and it made learning better. And that is really the key. How do we get the technology in the hands of the kids as quickly as possible?
So, thanks, Mike. Jeff, I'm really interested in your take on this, and thanks for allowing me to prompt you to raise your hand. I'm really interested in the piece of how does this play into sort of learner-centric models, and specifically the sort of the tangible benefits that your students get from being involved in open source.
Well, it's important at this point to reiterate, I forget whether it was Laura or Sheila who said this earlier, but they made a really powerful point. This year I'm working with our second language learner population here at the school that I'm at, and I'm doing some interdisciplinary teaching with two of my colleagues. And we started to explore this year with our second language learners Scratch, eToys. I'm starting to experiment a bit with Alice, and all of these things I discovered by only weeks ago, so several of them, and because they were free software, I was able to convince the instructional technology coordinator here at the school to have them installed school-wide, and he just did that. There was no year-long wait, there was no a process of having to go through a funding allocation, and we were able to be creative and to explore and experiment, and it's it's benefited our students tremendously. I also have students, programming students, involved directly in creating free software, and there's another level of benefit because they can get mentored by working on real-world projects side by side with experts in software development. And we don't need to sign a non-disclosure agreement or go through, the first step doesn't have to be to talk to a lawyer before my students can meet directly with people developing real-world applications that people are using all over the place.
So, Jeff, I frequently reference you and your students when I'm talking about the value of teaching open source in programming courses. Is it as simple as saying that your students are better prepared in terms of real-world needs to be employed, or is it more complicated than that? But is there a definite difference in their preparation level by using open source?
Absolutely. One of the most effective educational relationships in the history of humanity is the master-apprentice relationship. And what free software enables us to do is, especially with the advent of the Internet, is to participate. My students can participate as apprentices with master programmers. And they're able to do that because the projects that they're working on are free. They have the freedom to share the source code. They have the freedom to allow the students to participate at whatever level they're ready and then to move up that level. At this point, many of my students have left high school as professional programmers because of that opportunity.
So, Laura, I don't think we've heard from you or from Sheila. Did either of you want to address this question?
Yeah, I did. I think that the open source really sort of levels the playing field, and teachers get to know students on another level because you're sharing, you're working together. They're teaching you, you're teaching them. They don't look upon you as the one who holds all the knowledge, the keys to learning. We're all in this together, and I think that is something that can't be really described. You have to really be in it. You're really in the thick of things with students as they are constructing, collaborating, working together in using the open source tools. It's really just a wonderful experience, an extension to learning in the classroom.
So Sheila, I know you, I think you actually ran an LTSP lab when you were teaching.
Yes, I did.
So
I got, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, do you think it's fair to say that if we really wanted a computer pervasive environment for our kids at schools, if we really wanted a computer in front of each student, that we actually could do it? It's just that we aren't willing to listen to open source?
Oh, yes. I think we could do it. I think that a lot of the things that we get rid of, especially, everybody wants the new thing. The computers that I use for my kids, I got out of the dumpster of the school district where I lived. They were throwing them away. They were getting the new Macs, and they were throwing away the old PCs with the big square boxes. And I had 9 computers and one server, and it worked wonderfully well. Linux never dropped, never broke down. We never got the blue screen of death, nothing. It worked like a charm all year. And that, to me, open source was the lifeline. You couldn't always, if your school only has 1 computer lab or 2 computer labs, you have to sign up to go into the computer lab. It's not, if you really want to do some serious projects, you can't always get into use the computers when you need to. So having a sizable number of computers in the classroom really worked well for me and solved that problem. So it just changes the learning situation in your classroom, and it also acted as a I didn't have classroom management problems, let me put it that way, because the kids really wanted to work on the computers, and their behavior improved greatly. I had 6th grade students, so it was a great experience.
So Laura, I'm really glad. Thank you, Sheila. Laura, I'm really glad that you get the last word on this, because I think you have a lot to contribute. From your experiences in Indiana, what picture can you paint of the potential of open source software?
Well, I think if we start looking at it from the student perspective, I mean, I spent the weekend with a bunch of 14, 15, 16, and 17-year-olds. I mean, their expectation is instantaneous and better and better and better. And so when you look at open source software, I mean, Jeff had brought up using Scratch. I mean, as soon as the students come in with another piece of open source software, or someone who has tweaked the code and it's better, they'll jettison that and move to the next one. It allows that flexibility. And I think when we're looking at student-centered education, that's the expectation of the kids that are in school right now. Not that you wait 2 or 3 years for the bugs in the program to be fixed. Not that you wait 2 or 3 years when you want to use some type of a feature with your software, that it's instantaneous. And open source really has that potential. I think what's missing now, and is one of the things we were working on in Indiana, is coming up with that clearinghouse of open source titles and seeing the new fixes that are coming onto different software, so that teachers really have all the tools in front of them and can make the decisions, as well as students, as to which piece of software best serves their needs at that particular time. And that might change in 3 months or in 6 months. If the class Jeff is teaching next semester, in the fall, has a tweak, and world languages now is going to be, he's going to be wanting to use, different software so he can do audio conferencing. He can easily pick that up and pull it down and not wait, to write a letter to the software company and find out with a year or 2 later if they're going to put those pieces in place. But I think what we are missing, it goes back to that clearinghouse, the ease of use for teachers. Most teachers don't want to sit on OSALT or SourceForge or any of these large sites and download 30 or 40 different open source application softwares to find the one that fits what they need. And that is not available right now for ease of use for teachers. It's not available from the resource side, and it's also not available on the application side. And so I think there's anybody listening who's looking for a nonprofit program, I think there's a huge need to develop that piece for teachers and students.
Okay, so that's our perfect segue into the how do we get their piece of the panel now. So Laura's saying there's a need for a clearinghouse. Steve OC in the chat earlier, asked a question about, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it raised for me the issue of who's actually going to do the things that we feel need to be done. So let's shift to that gear and talk about what actually needs to happen. Laura says we need a clearinghouse. Again, let's do raising of hands. What else do we need, and who can provide the things that we think are needed? So Steve, you get your first participant to actually get the mic if you were raising your hand. Go ahead. You need to click the mic button down on the lower left if you wanted to talk. Oh, you don't have a mic. Well, go ahead and put it in the chat, and we're going to let Kathryn then take the next lead.
Steve, from an Australian perspective, I agree with Laura completely. I think that not only do teachers require the access to titles and so on, but also I don't know whether you have technicians located in schools, but we have technicians whose role is just to make sure that things keep working in schools. And I think that if they had an endorsed site from a Department of Education that was where they could go to get open source support, that would offset some of their concerns of feeling like they were going into the netherland of the internet to get answers. We know that those answers will come, but I don't think that gives the level of security that people in schools doing mission critical work require. So I agree completely with Laura. I also agree with Mike in that I think there's some work to be done with leaders. I think if we're talking about change management processes, that we really could do with working with the school leaders to work with them about what the benefits are for their students and for their school with open source. I'll leave it there because I know other people will want to talk, but they're a couple of they're a couple of things that I'm thinking about.
Mike, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I mean, and Kathryn and I have talked about this shortly, just a short while ago, as a matter of fact. But there are two or three things, and I don't want to take the focus away from education, teaching, and learning, because that is where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. But the Linux community has to start looking for a common installer, a tech director who's new to Linux, trying to install an RPM program on a Debian machine using a package called Alien is totally out of his element or her element. We really have to start letting these companies who do the major packages, Red Hat, Novell, Canonical, etc., that there are key pieces here. If Linux is going to have the impact that it should be having today in schools, we really have to focus on a common installer. We have to focus on a system that lets people go to this repository of software and pull it down and try it, without being an expert in installing Debian packages or installing RPM packages or whatever. I do think that on the technical side, and Kathryn and I talked about putting together a group, an international group, to start outlining for these companies what education needs and be very specific so they can respond to it. And I think if we do that, Linux is going to take off, open source is going to take off, and it's going to be huge. But I think if we don't do it, I think there are major bumps in the road that we're going to have trouble with.
Go ahead, Sheila.
A lot of the states have regional organizations that provide professional development services for teachers. I know in New York we have BOCES, the Board of Cooperative Educational Services, and they provide professional training as well as technology resources and equipment. We even have teacher centers, which are in danger of going down under the economic crunch that we're under. But those are entities that could be the cheerleaders for the open source market, because their focus is to provide resources to school districts for a very affordable price, and they offer courses for teachers during the summer breaks, or they are the clearinghouse for resources that help teachers in the classroom all year long. So they would be the ideal group to promote the use of open source and Linux and Red Hat, all of these things that we need so desperately. And I know there are a lot of states who have professional development entities like this, that perhaps that could be a place to start.
So I don't want to stop anyone else from responding, and please raise your hand if you'd like to. But this raises a question for me, Sheila, right off the bat, which is this actually, do we think that this is a problem with open source, and is it actually a larger problem in general with regard to computers in schools?
You're saying that
are we just not doing a good job transforming education with computers, and is the lack of adoption of open source just another symptom of our not doing a good job integrating computers into the educational environment?
That's you're making a very good point. Yeah, that has some validity.
So, Laura, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what pretty much all of us have, and reading the chat, pretty much what everyone's saying. If in the pre-service programs, teachers become users of technology, but they don't use it for teaching. They use it for personal use. Then they go into a classroom and they have access to a lab for 35 minutes a week. It never becomes integral to what they're doing. And then you're going to turn around and put open source on top of it, and for the little they use it, and then here's hundreds of thousands of programs, pick what you want. And I do think it becomes one of those, I don't need all of Google. Give me 5 resources for what I'm doing. And I think that gets back to that piece that, it needs to be staged. There needs to be some type of a deployment in schools that walks teachers through it. Everything else they're using, when they're using a whiteboard and they're using a projector, I mean, it's a very short training. The rest of it is very transparent. It's just as a tool in what they're using. And we haven't gotten there with technology. I think that's part of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the fact, because back to kind of what Kathryn was saying, yes, there is a learning curve. Yes, it does need to be addressed. But teaching somebody how to use a piece of software isn't going to make them effective in the classroom until they can see how it's going to impact student achievement. And those tools are not there yet. They're getting there. And I think, but it requires a teacher to go watch another teacher. And, in my experience, teachers are not getting out of the classroom. And so that becomes very, very difficult. But telling a teacher, here's 15 pieces of software, is, somewhere along the lines of saying, here's a library, go find resources, and you should be set to go and teach. And I think that's where this hole exists. It exists in proprietary software, although when schools tend to purchase that, they tend to purchase the big training pack that comes with it, where open source doesn't have that big training pack. And I think that's where a lot of the drop-off becomes. Teachers see all this great potential in a workshop. They go back to their classroom and they think, well, I have to teach 16th century literature. I don't have time to do this from scratch.
Okay, so this is really getting interesting for me. I also want to make sure that we have time for Q&A, although with a smaller audience, I don't think we're going to have to worry as much about that. But I want to invite anybody at this point to be thinking about a question to ask. And I'm going to ask very specifically a question, which is, why are we not seeing organizations like Red Hat and Novell or IBM really step into this space and help make it happen?
I have no idea. Red Hat had talked about actually doing that a few years ago, and I think because of their shift in education focus, we had actually met with some of them about building a clearinghouse and kind of getting at those, kind of looking at the first use tools and then moving into kind of less used tools, and same with the curriculum, and it just didn't materialize.
Mike, I was hoping you would address this one as well.
We're dealing with 2 issues here, I think. We're dealing with the IBM issue. And this is not to be disrespectful of IBM, because they're big open source supporters now. But it used to be that everyone bought IBM. Data processing shops bought IBM mainframes. They did that because it might not be the fastest, it might not be the best, it might not be exactly what they needed, but they knew they wouldn't get fired over it. So they bought IBM. We're a little bit in that same boat right now. Tech directors in local schools tend to buy what they know, and they tend to buy what they know that they know how to work. I mean, it may not be what they need, but that's what they buy. So along with that, Red Hat, for example, I mean, this is the honest truth. We had one school in Indiana who chose Red Hat to use in their one-to-one implementation in their high school, and it had difficulties. Novell, on the other hand, put an engineer in the field here in Indiana to work with schools. So Novell tended to do better than Red Hat when it came to fixing problems. Once again, Red Hat committed, and as Laura said, we were unable to consummate that commitment. They committed to do it, but they didn't see profits rolling in. You know, schools weren't picking it up. They weren't paying for it. They wanted lower prices. They didn't want to pay the top fees that Red Hat charges its commercial customers. And as a result of that, Red Hat backed out. Novell has pretty much done its own thing, you know, with SUSE. And Ubuntu now is probably becoming the most popular of all because it has the least strings attached. So as an OS, you know, that's the first key, is you got to get the OS in place and convince people that they need to move to one-to-one. I mean, we somehow...
Go ahead.
Well, I just want to mention one final thing, and that is the fact that we're now caught on this computer-student ratio thing, the student-computer ratio, and everyone thinks they're 4-to-1, and 4-to-1 is so much better than they were 10 years ago. So they just want to stay at 4-to-1, and that's a lousy way to measure accomplishment in schools with respect to technology.
Okay, so this is fascinating for me, and I'd like to point out what seems to be there seems to be a little bit of tension between a couple of ideas, and help me understand if maybe I'm missing something. But Laura says, you know, part of the reason that open source is not successful in schools is because we're not providing the kind of curricular package or support that the commercial companies are. But we're also saying that the organizations like, or the products like Ubuntu, which have no strings attached, are the ones that are actually succeeding. So is there a little bit of wisdom coming out here? I mean, can we say that because if computing really hasn't transformed schools, then trying to follow the model that's currently being used for deploying computers may not actually be the best model for open source? So please push back on that. Laura, I see you raised your hand, so feel free to go ahead.
Well, I think there are two different populations. You know, when Mike's talking about Ubuntu, the adoption is happening at the tech director. The teachers generally don't have much say in the operating system that's being used. They generally do have say in the curriculum applications that will be used in their classroom. And, you know, in Indiana, Ubuntu is the most popular. And Moodle is also. And they're, you know, but what we found with Moodle, which was interesting, is, you know, it starts with the quizzes, it moves to the hot potato type stuff, and then it actually moves into that deeper thinking. And so, you know, it does start with a comfort level for the teachers. And I guess when I'm saying packages, I'm not meaning turnkey packages, but I am meaning the pieces that teachers and students would use in day-to-day education. I think that's, you know, that's the piece in open source. And it's out there. Everybody has it. It's just not in one place or in multiple places that teachers and students have access to. You need to go out, and I'm watching, you know, as everyone's blogging, and they're going, you know, has anyone looked at this one site or this one site or this one site? And we've been at this for 6, 7, 8 years. Some people even far longer. There should be some place where this information can be housed. And I think Australia should take the lead.
Are you listening, Kathryn?
I'm listening. I was going to say that the US could take the lead. From our point of view, from my point of view in Australia, one of the good things about these sorts of conversations is that I'm reassured that countries such as yourselves are engaged and deeply involved in open source, because we look to the UK and the US in particular for trends in schooling. I do think, though, that some sort of clearinghouse that we've sort of mulled over a bit is a very good idea, and if there's some way that we could take that forward, I think that would actually make quite a lot of difference. I also, just a fairly flippant point, but apart from the one that I just wrote, that I don't think IT companies really understand the complexity of school environments, but also we don't see open source advertised on the TV. I don't know whether you see the Microsoft ads that we see, but we see Microsoft ads that are promoting that they'll change everybody's lives and everything will be much, much happier because they've used Microsoft. When I was in Frankfurt a couple of years ago, I saw this big sign that said, Linux makes Oracle unbreakable, and it's the one and only sign I've ever seen. I stood and took a photo of it because I was so impressed, that really promoted open source. And I think that not only does open source need to be promoted in the public mind, but it also it would be a good way of giving people such as ourselves a bit of a shot in the arm for feeling like we're doing something worthwhile.
Okay, I got a little distracted because I checked my email and there were several messages from people saying they couldn't get into the room because they were getting a message that the room was locked. So maybe we did have more interest in the topic than showed by the numbers who appeared. And good that we're recording because we'll be able to share that out. So I apologize, Kathryn, for not fully hearing the end of that remarks. So tell us where to go from there. What's our final question of the evening?
Steve, it's Kathryn. I think that the strength of the argument about open source rests in what a difference it can make to student lives, and I think the fact that we really have to ensure that students leave school not hooked on being only able to use proprietary software, but have the problem-solving skills and have the information and synthesis skills to be able to be self-contained and capable in their own right of being able to not only access software but also to manipulate it, because computers are the way that students' lives are mediated through computers, and if they don't have an ability to control that environment, then I don't think as teachers we're living up to our responsibilities. So I think that for me, where does it go to has to always work. We have to put the student at the centre of our debates and our arguments. And I think if we do that, along with promoting it, getting companies like Red Hat and so on and Oracle to really promote it with as much enthusiasm as Microsoft does, then I think that there's some of the places that I'd like to see us taking ourselves forward to.
Great, thank you. Jeff, final thoughts?
Well, I think that we are confronted as a species with a number of very serious problems. I tell my two sons all the time that they're the ones who are going to have to figure out how to solve the global warming and world hunger and issues like that. And we need people who think and share ideas and develop the tools to solve problems like that. And I always viewed the free software movement in general as part of all of that. That my students and the students who are exposed to those kinds of ideas think about how you create the world, and that will put them in a better place to be able to address the problems of tomorrow.
Sheila?
I agree with that. The technology, open source, it's wonderful, but it is just a tool. It just is something for us to use to hone the skills that we need to solve the world's problems, as you say. So it's not the Microsoft or the name of the software. It's what can you do with it? What kind of learning can you construct? How can you collaborate with others using the tools of open source, and having an affordable price, free, is the attraction. And yes, we do need to have a huge marketing campaign to let people know, and schools know, and teachers know the availability of the open source tools and how it can be integrated into their everyday classroom practice. Just like they use any other learning or teaching aid in their room, technology and the use of it is not something to run away from or think that it's hard or strange or just something that they're not good at doing. It can impact the learning that happens in the classroom, and that is what we are looking for. That is what we want. We want to make good, self-sufficient citizens of the world, and open source will allow all schools to get to that goal.
Mike, final thoughts?
Thank you. First of all, I think this discussion has been uplifting. It's encouraging to hear so many people talking and asking questions and making comments. And, sometimes I think as people who work in the education area, we overcomplicate things. And I'm thinking back to the very beginning of this session when Kathryn, who now is undoubtedly a world leader in this area, was talking about how she became involved. And indeed, her young son convinced her to look at open source. Maybe we need to listen more. Listen to students and somehow get school people to listen, because out of the mouths of babes sort of came to mind when Kathryn said that. As Laura said, and what we've seen here in Indiana, students don't care. They love the fact that they have access to research, access to writing tools. They adore it. Teachers don't care. So if students don't care and they love it, and teachers don't care and they love it because of wonderful applications like Moodle, why aren't we seeing the adoption? Perhaps it's on the tech side. So we need to get them to listen more to the students, because the students are really what it's all about.
Okay, Laura, you get the final word.
This is like, everyone basically describes the universe, and then I get the final word. But, adding to that flexibility piece, and I think what this group can really do when you look at next steps is one of the things that we found is, when we were putting together open source software in science, one of the great open source software, there's Celestia, but there's also Stellarium. And one of the things we started finding when we went into the schools is, while it is like an open source planetarium software, the teachers that really were gravitating towards it were secondary English teachers, as they were teaching Shakespeare and other pieces where they, and Greek, any of the Greek literature where they were referencing whether it be zodiac signs or different constellations and things along those lines. It was English teachers that wanted that software, not science teachers. And I think part of it is getting us to make everything available to teachers and let teachers, start to see how other teachers are using it. and looking at a lot of these, Classroom 2.0 and some of the other sites that are out there, Curriki, but there isn't a lot of sharing of that. There's a lot of sharing of individual teaching methodology. And I think one of the things this group could do and look at is sharing of application software and sharing of ideas of, how Jeff is doing world languages and how some of these other pieces are coming into play.
Okay, well, we're right at our time. Thanks to each of our panelists. Again, I've been looking through my email and seeing a good number of people emailing me asking why the room was locked. So apologies. I have no idea. I've never even seen an Illuminate room get locked. But we do have the recording, and I will publish it out tonight so people are able to listen to this. I think this was a great discussion, and I think that I'm leaving with a couple of new thoughts for myself, which are very helpful, and also just a great deal of appreciation for each of you for taking the time to be here and for the contributions that you're making to education. I'm going to give you a clapping hand so you know how much I appreciate you. If you are willing to fill out the survey, it's helpful to know how you found the Illuminate environment. We do owe a great debt of gratitude to Illuminate for providing this good, stable platform, and to KnowledgeWorks for funding the interview series. Terrific from both of them, and thanks to you for attending tonight and for your contributions. And I'll look forward to increased understanding and future good discussions. So thanks and good night. Okay, moderators, you can't actually close that web tour because you'll close it for everybody else. So if you are trying to move it around, just move. Thank you much.